The letter arrived with the usual morning mail, tucked between supermarket flyers and the electric bill. The envelope, heavy beige paper, bore no return address, just Daniel's name and address penned in a familiar bold script. He recognized it instantly. Mark's handwriting. His college friend, though life had sent them down different paths in different states years ago. Mark had become a park ranger, choosing solitude and service to nature somewhere in the Rockies, while Daniel had plunged into the hustle of Chicago offices, numbers, and endless meetings. He tore open the envelope with a flicker of anticipation, expecting the usual news or perhaps a belated birthday wish. But the letter's contents were different. Mark was inviting him for a visit, not just to drop by for a couple of days, but to spend a real vacation in his ranger cabin, tucked away deep in Black Creek National Park. "It's quiet here like you've never heard in your city, Dan," Mark wrote. "The air's so fresh it'll make your head spin. Deer walk right up to the porch. You need a break. Get away from it all. Come on out. There's room." The offer was unexpected, tempting. An image of the remote cabin, surrounded by ancient trees, rose in Daniel's mind, a stark contrast to the gray reality of his 25th floor office. The thought of a change of scenery, a chance to see his old friend, felt like a breath of fresh air. He didn't hesitate long. That same day, he emailed Mark, confirming he'd come. Then began the process of settling dates, arranging time off work, finding suitable flights. Mark's email replies were delayed. Spotty reception out in the park, he explained. But his enthusiasm remained constant. Nearly a month passed before all the details were ironed out. Daniel took 2 weeks off work, booked tickets to the town nearest the park, and rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle there. Mark had warned that the last few miles might be tough for a regular car. Anticipation for the trip brightened his workdays. He pictured long walks in the woods, evening talks by the fireplace, the serenity of the wilderness. Finally, the day of departure arrived. The flight, baggage claim, picking up the rental, everything went smoothly. The drive from the airport to the edge of Black Creek Park took about 3 hours. The paved highway gave way to a gravel road that wound between hills thick with pine and oak. The sun was already dipping westward, painting the sky in warm hues. Mark had sent detailed instructions for finding the cabin, noting turns and landmarks. The final stretch, about 5 miles, was a narrow, barely visible forest track where tree branches laced together overhead, forming a green tunnel. Daniel drove slowly, carefully consulting the hand-drawn map Mark had provided. At last he saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, built of dark logs, with a low roof and a stone chimney. It looked just as he'd imagined, a secluded refuge in the wilderness. He killed the engine and got out of the car. Silence greeted him. Not the peaceful quiet he'd expected, but an oppressive, ringing emptiness. Not a sound, save for the rustle of leaves in a light breeze. No light shone from the porch. No smoke rose from the chimney. He walked to the door and knocked. No answer. He knocked louder, called Mark's name. Silence. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Inside, twilight reigned, and the distinct smell of stale air and dust hung heavy. The furnishings were simple. A table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with a stove and sink, an old sofa against one wall, and a door presumably leading to the bedroom. A thin but noticeable layer of dust coated every surface. On the table sat a mug with the dried dregs of coffee at the bottom. There were no dirty dishes in the sink. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged. Everything suggested no one had lived here for a long time, perhaps several weeks. A sense of unease stirred in Daniel's chest. Where was Mark? Why hadn't he been met? He pulled out his cell phone. As expected in this remote place, there was no signal, not a single bar. Attempts to call or text were futile. He went back outside, walked around the cabin. No sign of Mark or his vehicle. The sun had nearly vanished behind the treetops. Shadows stretched rapidly, creeping across the clearing. It was growing cold. The thought of staying here alone, in his missing friend's empty cabin, was unsettling. He decided to head back to town, find a motel, and contact the park administration in the morning. He got into the rental car, turned the key in the ignition. The starter clicked once, twice, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again. Same result. The engine was dead. Daniel slammed his fist on the steering wheel. The situation was getting worse. He was stranded deep in the woods, no communication, a broken-down car, and his friend had vanished. Darkness was falling fast. Walking through the unfamiliar forest at night was madness. With a heavy heart, he realized he had no choice. He would have to spend the night in this empty cabin. Daniel carried his backpack from the car to the cabin, shutting the door firmly behind him, though he knew the flimsy bolt wouldn't be much of a deterrent against anything or anyone. Determined. Inside, it felt unwelcoming. Someone else's dwelling, filled with silent evidence of its owner's absence, pressed in on him with its emptiness. He switched on the only working light, a dim lamp over the table that barely pushed back the gloom in the corners of the room. Scanning the modest interior, he searched for any clue, a note, some hint as to where Mark might have gone. On a shelf near the small iron stove lay a few books on forestry, park maps, an old pair of binoculars. In the desk drawer he found stationery supplies, a couple of empty notebooks, and a manual for a two-way radio. But no radio itself. The bedroom held a narrow bed covered with a gray army blanket and a wardrobe with a small amount of ranger clothing, all neatly folded, but also coated in dust. Nothing unusual, nothing that could explain the sudden disappearance. He found a few canned goods in a kitchen cupboard, beans, stewed meat, and a package of crackers. Not much, but better than nothing. He didn't dare cook on the stove, settling for cold beans straight from the can. He had little appetite. Anxiety had dulled his hunger. As complete darkness fell outside, the cabin seemed to sink to the bottom of a black ocean. The forest, which by day had seemed merely wild and uninhabited, transformed at night into a source of indistinct menace. The familiar daytime sounds, birds singing, insects chirping, fell silent, replaced by the night's chorus. Rustlings, the creak of old trees, the distant mournful howl of a coyote. At first Daniel tried to ignore them, blaming an overactive imagination and frayed nerves. He sat on the sofa, trying to read one of Mark's books by the dim lamplight, but the words blurred before his eyes, his thoughts constantly returning to his unenviable situation. The silence inside the cabin became almost physically palpable, broken only by his own breathing and the thudding of his heart. And then he heard it. First, the soft snap of a dry twig somewhere very close, just outside the wall. Then a distinct rustling in the undergrowth, as if something large was pushing through the bushes. And after that, a low, vibrating growl that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the roar of a bear he might have expected to hear in these parts. The sound was guttural, ragged, filled with a kind of primal malice. It came from the windowless side of the cabin. Daniel leaped up from the sofa, his heart pounding in his throat. He instinctively grabbed the fireplace poker standing near the small iron stove. The heavy piece of metal didn't seem like much protection, but it was the only thing within reach. He moved slowly to the window, trying not to make a sound. The moon was hidden behind clouds that night, and near absolute darkness reigned outside. He peered into the gloom, trying to make out anything beyond the faint pool of light cast by the lamp. And then he saw movement. An indistinct, enormous shadow darted between the trees at the edge of the clearing, only some 20 yards from the cabin. The shadow was shaggy, massive, its outlines blurred in the darkness, but its size was terrifying. It moved heavily, yet quickly, disappearing behind tree trunks. Daniel recoiled from the window, his breath catching. The growl came again, closer now, right beneath the cabin walls. It seemed the creature was circling the cabin, studying it, sniffing. He could hear its heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on the logs. Fear paralyzed him. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, gripping the poker until his knuckles ached, not daring to move, terrified of attracting its attention. The growling and footsteps sometimes drew nearer, sometimes receded, but the creature didn't leave. It circled the cabin, occasionally pausing as if listening to what was happening inside. The hours dragged agonizingly. Each minute felt like an eternity. Daniel didn't sit down, afraid that if he relaxed for even a second, he wouldn't be able to react. He stood listening to the sounds of the night forest, trying to distinguish ordinary rustles from the steps of the unseen predator. He imagined a huge beast, all fangs and claws, prowling outside, separated from him only by the thin log walls. The images were vague, but no less terrifying for it. Sleep was out of the question. Adrenaline and fear kept him in a state of extreme tension. He flinched at every snap of a twig, every howl of the wind that sounded like a sinister growl. Only when the sky in the east began to slowly lighten, taking on a grayish hue, did the sounds outside gradually fade. The last distant growl died away deep in the forest. Daniel waited a while longer, until the first rays of sun pierced through the cracks in the shutters. He went to the window and cautiously looked out. The clearing was empty. The silence seemed deafening after the night's horror. Exhausted from lack of sleep and the terror he'd endured, he felt a wave of relief so strong his knees buckled. The night was over. The sun climbed higher, flooding the clearing with bright light that seemed to banish the remnants of the night's fears. Daniel still felt a tremor running through his body, the aftermath of the sustained tension. He was sitting at the table, mechanically finishing the cold beans from the can, when the front door creaked open. He spun around, his heart leaping back into his throat. Mark stood in the doorway. He looked exactly as Daniel remembered him, solidly built, with a weather-beaten face, wearing a park ranger uniform. A wide, good-natured smile played on his face. "Dan, you finally made it. I was starting to think you got lost," he said cheerfully, stepping into the cabin and dropping a small backpack on the floor. Seeing his friend alive and well was such a relief that Daniel momentarily forgot the previous night's terror. He jumped up from the table, rushed over to Mark. "Mark, where have you been?" "I got here last night. You weren't here. The cabin was empty, the car broke down, and last night something was outside, some huge animal growling." He blurted out all in one breath. Mark laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Whoa, easy there, Dan. It's okay. Sorry I wasn't here to meet you. Work, you know. Had an urgent call, check on a remote section. Some lost hikers, had to lead them out. Only got back before dawn. The car. Yeah, the roads out here can be rough. We'll take a look at it later. As for the animal, don't worry about it. Probably just a bear wandering by, or maybe a moose. They own the place, but they don't usually get too close to people. You're just spooked by forest sounds after city life." The explanation sounded simple and logical. A ranger's typical duties, wild animals in the forest. It all made sense. Daniel's anxiety began to recede, replaced by the joy of the reunion and a touch of embarrassment over his panic. "But that's all small stuff, Dan," Mark continued, his eyes taking on a strange gleam. "You got here just in time. I've got something to show you. Stumbled onto something recently. Something totally incredible. You can't even imagine. It's worth the long drive, the busted car, the nighttime scares." He spoke quickly, excitedly, gesturing with his hands. There were notes in his voice Daniel hadn't heard from his friend before, an almost feverish, manic excitement. "What is it? What did you find?" Daniel asked, intrigued, but also slightly wary of Mark's enthusiasm. "Words can't explain it, Dan. You have to see it with your own eyes. Trust me, you won't regret it. Get ready, let's grab a quick breakfast and we'll head out. It's a bit of a hike, but it's worth it." Mark efficiently pulled a package of jerky, a thermos of hot coffee, and a couple of energy bars from his pack. They ate quickly, Mark barely touching his food, constantly hurrying Daniel along. His gaze wandered. He kept glancing at the door, as if afraid their miracle might disappear. After the brief breakfast, Mark grabbed his pack, checked the radio clipped to his belt, and nodded to Daniel. "Let's go." He led him not back down the track Daniel had driven in on, but turned directly into the woods behind the cabin, heading deeper into the thicket. There was no trail here. They went straight ahead, pushing through brush and stepping over fallen trees. Mark strode ahead with a quick, confident pace, never looking back. Daniel could barely keep up, feeling yesterday's unease return. His friend's strange nervousness, his insistence, that feverish gleam in his eyes, all of it, combined with the memory of the previous night's eerie sounds, created a heavy sense of foreboding. "Mark, maybe you could finally tell me where we're going, and what this discovery is." Daniel tried again, breathless from the fast pace. Mark just waved him off, not slowing his stride. "You'll see. Soon. Words are useless here, Dan. Just follow me." They walked for over an hour, venturing deeper and deeper into the wild, untouched forest. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy overhead. The silence here was different, not empty, like at the cabin, but oppressive, full of hidden life and perhaps hidden threats. Daniel began to doubt the wisdom of this venture, but the thought of turning back alone in this unfamiliar forest was just as frightening as Mark's strange behavior. He kept walking, scanning his surroundings carefully, unsure what lay ahead. They walked for several hours. The sun began its descent, casting long, slanted rays through the foliage, painting the tree trunks in hues of gold and orange. The forest grew denser, the climb steeper. Daniel felt his strength failing. The long hike over rough terrain, especially after a sleepless night, was taking its toll. His leg muscles hummed with fatigue. His breathing grew heavy. Mark, however, seemed tireless. He pressed on with the same relentless energy, his excitement undiminished, though he spoke less now, focusing on the route. Finally, as twilight began to deepen beneath the canopy, Mark stopped in a small, relatively flat clearing surrounded by a dense wall of conifers. "Okay, this is far enough for today," he announced. "Easy to break your neck out here in the dark. We'll camp here tonight, continue in the morning. We're not far now." The decision to camp right in the middle of the wilderness didn't thrill Daniel. But he didn't argue. He truly couldn't walk much further. Mark dropped his pack and, without preamble, pulled out 2 compact one-person tents. He tossed one to Daniel. "Set yours up over there by those firs," he directed, pointing to the opposite edge of the clearing, about 15 yards from where he planned to set up his own. Separate tents, pitched that far apart, struck Daniel as an odd choice for 2 friends camping in the woods, but exhaustion outweighed curiosity or suspicion. He silently began setting up his temporary shelter. The tent was lightweight and simple, and he managed it in a few minutes while Mark built a small campfire in the center of the clearing. They ate another can of food each, barely speaking. Mark seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed somewhere deeper in the woods toward their mysterious destination. Daniel felt utterly drained. He had barely finished his portion when he crawled into his tent. The sleeping bag felt like the pinnacle of comfort. His head touched the makeshift pillow he made from his rolled-up jacket, and he sank almost instantly into a deep, heavy sleep, too exhausted even to contemplate the potential dangers of the night forest. His awakening was abrupt, tearing him from the viscous darkness of sleep. He didn't know how much time had passed, but outside the tent, impenetrable night reigned once more. He'd been woken by a noise. It was the same noise he'd heard the previous night near the cabin. First, the soft snap of a dry twig, then another, closer. Heavy, ragged breathing, almost a wheeze, and the low, guttural growl that made his blood run cold. The unknown beast had returned. Or was it another? The sound was the same. It was here, near their camp. Daniel lay motionless, holding his breath, listening intently. The sounds came from the trees bordering the clearing. The creature seemed to be circling their camp again, slowly, as if studying it. His gaze flickered toward Mark's tent, a dim silhouette in the darkness. He expected to hear some noise from that direction. A question, movement, but not a sound came from the other tent. Absolute silence. Was Mark sleeping so soundly he couldn't hear the horrific growling and heavy footsteps just yards away? Or was he too lying motionless, frozen in fear, afraid to betray his presence? This uncertainty frightened Daniel almost more than the creature's presence itself. The realization that they were in separate tents, divided by yards of darkness, unable to know what was happening to the other, amplified his sense of isolation and vulnerability. He was alone again with the unseen threat, but now, not even the thin walls of the cabin separated him from it. Only the flimsy fabric of the tent. The growling ebbed and flowed. Several times, Daniel heard snuffling and a sound like the beast sniffing the ground right outside his tent. He curled into a ball inside his sleeping bag, squeezed his eyes shut, praying the creature would leave, overlook him, lose interest in his fragile shelter. The rest of the night became an agony of anxious waiting. He didn't sleep a wink, listening to every rustle, every sound from outside. He tried to discern any shapes through the thin tent fabric, but saw only darkness. Time stretched again, becoming an endless succession of moments steeped in pure fear. When the first hints of dawn tinged the sky above the treetops, the sounds outside gradually faded, just as they had the night before. The unseen beast had once again retreated with the coming of day. As soon as the dawn had sufficiently dispelled the night's gloom, Daniel cautiously unzipped his tent. The air was crisp and cool. The surrounding forest seemed calm and serene, as if the nightmare had never happened. He slowly climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from tension and immobility. The first thing he did was look toward Mark's tent, and what he saw made him freeze. Mark's tent was shredded. The fabric hung in tatters from the bent poles of the frame. As if savaged by something large, powerful, and incredibly furious, Daniel slowly approached, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around the demolished tent, Mark's belongings were scattered. The sleeping bag had been dragged out and was also ripped in several places. The contents of his backpack, clothes, canned food, a map, a flashlight, lay strewn on the ground in complete disarray. The scene was one of utter terrifying destruction, but Mark himself was nowhere to be seen. Daniel frantically scanned the scene, his eyes darting across the clearing, over the ground around the ruined tent. He searched for signs of a struggle, traces of blood, his friend's body, anything that might explain what had happened. But to his growing horror and bewilderment, he found nothing of the sort. The ground around the tent was trampled, marked with deep impressions unlike those of any normal forest animal, too large, their edges indistinct. But there wasn't a drop of blood, no indication of a fight between a man and his attacker, no drag marks, nothing to suggest Mark had been taken by force. He had simply vanished. Then Daniel remembered the night before. He strained his ears, trying to recall the sounds. He clearly remembered the growling, the footsteps, the creatures breathing near the camp, even near his own tent. But he hadn't heard a thing from Mark's tent. No cries for help, no sounds of a struggle, no death rattle, only silence. That silence now seemed sinister. How could Mark, an experienced ranger, not have woken from the noise? And if he had woken, why hadn't he yelled, tried to fight back, or called for help? The quiet, soundless disappearance from a shredded tent made the situation even more baffling and terrifying. Trying to fight down rising panic, Daniel desperately searched for a logical explanation. Perhaps Mark had woken before the beast attacked the tent directly. Perhaps he'd heard its approach, assessed the danger, and realizing he couldn't handle it alone, decided to slip out quietly and escape into the woods, saving his own life. Maybe he was hiding nearby, waiting for the danger to pass. The thought offered a sliver of hope. If Mark was alive and close by, he should return once he was sure the beast was gone. Daniel decided to stay put and wait. He couldn't abandon his friend if he was still alive, and he had no idea where to go alone in this dense forest. He gathered Mark's scattered belongings, piling them neatly beside the remnants of the tent. He checked the fire pit. It was cold. Then he began circling the perimeter of the clearing, peering into the woods, softly calling Mark's name. Only the forest's silence answered. The entire day passed in tense, agonizing waiting. Daniel sat by the cold fire pit, periodically getting up to walk the camp's edge again, to call out for his friend again. The sun crawled slowly across the sky, shadows lengthening. The forest around him went about its usual business. Birds sang, leaves rustled, but Mark never appeared. As evening approached, hope began to fade, replaced by heavy foreboding, and the realization that he was utterly alone in this hostile, incomprehensible forest, where people vanished and nightmarish creatures roamed. Another night was approaching, and the thought of spending it here, next to his missing friend's ravaged tent, filled him with icy dread. The third night in the woods became a different kind of ordeal for Daniel. He didn't pitch his tent, fearing it would attract attention. Instead, he found shelter in a dense thicket at the edge of the clearing, crawling beneath the low-hanging branches of an old spruce. Beside him, he placed the heavy poker he still carried from the cabin, though he knew how futile a defense it would be against whatever had destroyed Mark's tent. This night passed relatively quietly, at least in the immediate vicinity of the camp. There was no growling, no heavy footsteps circling the clearing. The beast seemed to have lost interest in this spot, or perhaps it had gone off to hunt elsewhere in the forest. However, there wasn't complete silence. From time to time, sounds drifted from the depths of the woods, somewhere far off, that made his blood run cold. A piercing, drawn-out roar unlike any animal cry he knew, and a heavy cracking, as if thick branches or even young tree trunks were snapping. These sounds were proof that the threat hadn't vanished. It had simply moved, lurking somewhere out there in the impenetrable darkness of the deep woods. Daniel barely slept, listening to these distant echoes of horror, flinching at every rustle. Morning brought a gray, overcast sky, and the certainty that waiting for Mark was pointless. Whatever had happened to his friend, he wasn't coming back. Staying put meant certain death, from starvation, exposure, or the claws of the thing that stalked this forest. He had to act. He had two options: try to find traces of Mark and understand what had happened, or try to get out of the forest, back to the cabin and the broken-down car, or ideally, toward the park boundaries, toward civilization. The first option seemed suicidal, following the trail of whatever had likely killed Mark. The second offered at least a chance. He made a desperate decision. Head east, using the sun, barely visible through the clouds, as his guide, hoping to reach the road he'd driven in on. He gathered his meager supplies, the last of the crackers, his water flask. Scanning the campsite one last time, he noticed Mark's shotgun lying near the shredded tent, apparently left inside overnight. It was a 12-gauge shotgun, fairly old, but it looked functional. Mark always carried it on patrol. Daniel wasn't an experienced shooter, but having a weapon offered at least some illusion of safety. He checked the chamber, it was loaded, and found a box of shells in Mark's pack. Slinging the shotgun over his shoulder, he set off. Walking through the trackless woods, guided only by the sun peeking occasionally through the clouds, proved far harder than he'd imagined. The forest was dense, crisscrossed by ravines, choked with fallen trees. He constantly lost his bearings, making detours to get around impassable sections. Hours passed, but the landscape scarcely changed. The same trees, bushes, ferns. He found no signs of human presence, no trails, no blazes on trees, no trash. The feeling grew that he was walking in circles. By midday, he realized he was completely lost. The sun vanished behind thick clouds, robbing him of his only guide. Panic began to rise again. He tried to stay calm, trying to recall scraps of knowledge about wilderness survival, but fear and exhaustion were winning. He trudged onward haphazardly, hoping to stumble upon some familiar landmark, a stream, a road. But the forest seemed endless and hostile. Twilight began to fall, surprisingly quickly under the overcast sky. Daniel knew he'd have to spend another night outdoors, this time in a completely unknown location. He started looking for a clearing or at least a relatively flat spot to make a makeshift camp, perhaps build a fire for warmth and to ward off animals. He had just spotted a small opening between some old pines when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Something dark and large flickered at the periphery of his vision. He spun around, raising the shotgun. From the forest depths, from the direction he'd just come, an enormous dark shadow was approaching him with incredible speed. It wasn't moving on four legs like a normal beast. It ran almost upright, on powerful hind legs covered in thick, dark fur. In the deepening twilight, illuminated by the beam of his headlamp which he'd switched on moments before, Daniel saw with horror the source of the shadow. It was a gigantic wolf, but distorted, grotesque, monstrously large. Its forelegs, resembling arms with long claws, were held close to its chest, its muzzle stretched in a silent snarl bearing rows of huge fangs. The creature moved with frightening agility and speed, its glowing yellow eyes fixed directly on Daniel. The sight of this monster, coming at him on two legs like a man, inspired a primal, irrational terror. Panic flooded Daniel's mind, washing away all thoughts of self-control. Instinct took over. He jerked up Mark's shotgun, the stock hitting his shoulder awkwardly, his finger convulsively squeezing the trigger. The deafening blast of the shotgun shattered the evening quiet, echoing off the tree trunks. In his haste, hands trembling, aiming more in the direction of the threat than at the target itself, he missed. The spray of pellets hit the ground and bushes a few feet from the monstrosity. To his utter astonishment, the creature didn't press the attack. It stopped abruptly about 30 yards away, freezing in place. The shot, it seemed, hadn't frightened it, but merely interrupted its charge. It straightened to its full, imposing height, at least 7 feet tall, and simply stood there, watching Daniel intently. The tremor still racking his body, the shotgun wavering in his hands, the sight of the halted monster gave him a shred of desperate courage. "Get out! Go away!" he yelled, his voice cracking with fear and strain. He even tried to make some kind of menacing growl, low and guttural, attempting to mimic the sounds he'd heard in the night, in the absurd hope of scaring the creature off. But the wolf-like creature, a werewolf, Daniel instantly labeled it in his mind, didn't react to his shouts or his clumsy attempts at intimidation. It didn't flee, nor did it resume its attack. It just stood there, silently, motionlessly watching him with its luminous yellow eyes. There was something far more terrifying in this still observation than in direct aggression. It felt as if the beast wasn't just seeing him, but assessing, studying, weighing him as an opponent, or as prey. The monster's chilling calm paralyzed Daniel more effectively than the fear of attack. He frantically reloaded the shotgun, the metallic clack of the action sounding obscenely loud in the tense silence. Should he shoot again, while he had the chance? While it stood still? But what if he missed again? Or only wounded it, enraging the beast? While he hesitated, struggling to decide, his ears caught a new sound. It came from the other direction, from the woods behind him. This noise was completely different, not stealthy but crashing forward recklessly. A deep rumbling, the snap of breaking branches and young trees, heavy footfalls that shook the ground. Something huge, incomparably larger than the werewolf, was moving through the thicket straight toward them. Daniel turned toward the sound, trying to see the source of the new threat in the deepening gloom. He saw only swaying treetops and snapping underbrush. The werewolf heard it too. Its reaction was instant and unexpected. It let out a furious, hate-filled snarl, directed not at Daniel, but toward the approaching noise. Then, without a second's hesitation, the monster spun around and bolted, not toward Daniel, but deeper into the forest, perpendicular to the path of the new arrival. Its massive figure vanished instantly into the darkness between the trees. The werewolf's reaction told Daniel more than his eyes could. If even this monster was fleeing, then whatever was coming must be unimaginably terrifying. The sound of snapping trees advanced with horrific speed. The ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly. Something colossal, dark, as tall, it seemed, as a small cabin, was moving inexorably toward him. Panic, which had momentarily subsided at the sight of the motionless werewolf, returned with renewed force, overwhelming him completely. Forgetting the shotgun, his exhaustion, everything, Daniel broke into a run. He ran blindly, wherever his feet would carry him, away from the approaching nightmare, snapping branches, stumbling over roots, hearing the rising crescendo of destruction behind him. Fear drove Daniel onward through the night forest. He ran without direction, instinctively dodging tree trunks, forcing his way through underbrush. Branches lashed his face, leaving stinging scratches, his feet tangled in roots, and he fell several times, hitting the ground hard, only to scramble up and run again. Behind him the relentless crashing continued, the sound of snapping trees, the heavy thud of giant footsteps. The creature didn't seem to be pursuing him specifically. It was simply moving in his general direction, flattening everything in its path, but the sheer proximity of its destructive passage filled Daniel with terror. He didn't know how far he ran, half a mile, maybe a mile. His lungs burned. His legs threatened to give out. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. Then, just as his strength was failing, he literally ran into something hard and wooden. Looking up, blinking sweat from his eyes, he saw in the weak beam of his headlamp a structure reaching skyward. A wooden watchtower, the kind sometimes built by park rangers for surveying the area and spotting fires. A ladder led up to a small platform about 30 feet above the ground. Without a second thought, he lunged for the ladder. It was old, some rungs looked rotten, but it felt sturdy enough. Climbing with the shotgun slung over his shoulder was awkward, but adrenaline fueled him. He scrambled up as fast as he could, expecting at any second to feel a massive hand close around his ankle. Finally, he reached the top platform, a small enclosure with a low ceiling and narrow slit windows like embrasures. He tumbled inside through a hatch in the floor and immediately slammed it shut, sliding a heavy wooden bolt. Gasping for breath, he pressed himself against the wall in the darkest corner, switched off his headlamp, and froze, listening. The crashing and snapping of trees seemed to pass by, gradually receding into the depths of the forest. The enormous creature had either not noticed him or the tower held no interest for it. Daniel was left alone in the darkness and relative quiet, shaking, whether from the cold night air seeping through the cracks in the walls or from the terror he'd endured. He spent the remainder of the night in the tower, huddled on the cold wooden floor, not daring even to peek outside. Morning arrived slowly, gray and damp. Daniel had recovered slightly, though his body ached from the run and the falls, and his nerves were stretched taut. He cautiously peered out one of the narrow windows. Below, there was only forest stretching in every direction. No sign of yesterday's monsters. He began to examine the interior of the watchtower. It was a simple observation post, spartanly furnished. A small table bolted to the wall, a stool, a few hooks for gear. And then his eyes fell on something lying on the table. An old, dusty two-way radio, the model often used by rangers and rescue teams. Hope flared in his chest, a chance to contact the outside world, call for help. He snatched up the radio. The hope died almost instantly. The radio's casing was cracked, the plastic fractured in several places, the antenna bent. It looked like it had been slammed against something hard or dropped from a significant height. The disappointment was bitter. He almost threw the useless device back onto the table, but something made him look closer. Yes, the casing was damaged, but when he carefully lifted a piece of broken plastic, he saw that the internal components, circuit boards, wires, contacts seemed intact at first glance. He wasn't an electronics expert, but in his youth he dabbled in amateur radio, soldered simple circuits. Faint memories of transistors, capacitors, and proper polarity surfaced. Was there a chance? Maybe only the power connection or the antenna contacts were damaged. It was his only chance. There was no other way to call for help. His phone still had no signal, and hiking out of the forest alone, not knowing the way or what he might encounter, was tantamount to suicide. He made his decision. He would try to fix the radio. In a corner, he found a box with some tools, a screwdriver, pliers, a roll of electrical tape, a knife. Not much, but something. He spent the entire day in the tower, engrossed in the painstaking work. He carefully dismantled the damaged casing, examined the circuit board, tested some connections using the battery and bulb from his headlamp. The work required intense concentration and a steady hand. A few wires had indeed come loose from their contacts, likely from the impact. He stripped their ends with the knife and tried to reconnect them, securing them with electrical tape. The work dragged on. The sun began its westward descent again, shadows lengthening. Daniel became so absorbed in the repair that he almost forgot the danger surrounding him, until he heard it again. The familiar low, guttural growl drifted up from below from the base of the tower. His heart plummeted. He cautiously crawled to the edge of the platform and shone his headlamp down. In the circle of light he saw it, the werewolf. The monster had returned. It stood at the base of the tower, head tilted back, its luminous yellow eyes staring right at Daniel. It circled the support beams, sniffing the ground, and growled again, no longer assessing, but threatening. The siege began without delay. The werewolf stopped merely observing. Letting out a furious roar, it charged and slammed its shoulder against one of the tower's wooden support beams. The structure shuddered. Then it began hammering the supports with its powerful, arm-like forelegs, leaving deep gouges from its claws in the wood. Wood splintered under the assault. Daniel scrambled back from the edge, realizing his refuge wasn't as secure as it had seemed. The monster wasn't leaving. It rammed the supports again and again, then tried to climb the structure. Its huge claws scraped against the wood, finding purchase in cracks and rough spots. It ascended with terrifying agility. Daniel frantically looked around for any weapon, any means of defense. The shotgun lay nearby, but shooting downwards at such an angle, especially at a moving target, was nearly impossible, and he feared missing and wasting precious shells. He grabbed the heavy headlamp, the only thing within reach. The wooden tower, old and none too sturdy, began to give way under the monster's ferocious attack. The floorboards beneath Daniel's feet creaked and shifted violently. Suddenly, there was a deafening crack. The werewolf managed to smash through several planks of the platform floor from below. An enormous clawed hand shot through the resulting hole, groping blindly in the darkness. Daniel cried out and scrambled back. The monster roared in fury and slammed the floor again, widening the breach. Now it could see Daniel. It thrust its head and shoulders through the gap, trying to reach him. Daniel fought back desperately. He smashed the heavy headlamp with all his strength against the beast's snout, aiming for its eyes. The werewolf howled in pain and recoiled for a moment, but immediately lunged forward again. Daniel ripped off pieces of splintered planking from the damaged wall and hurled them at the monster, but it was like throwing pebbles at a tank. The odds were impossible. The werewolf managed to seize Daniel's leg in its clawed grasp. Pain shot through his muscles. He yelled and tried to pull free, but the grip was iron. The monster pulled him forcefully toward the opening, dragging him from the relative safety of the enclosure out onto the open platform. Daniel fell onto the planks, the shotgun skittering away. He tried to crawl backward, but the werewolf was already hauling itself entirely onto the platform. It loomed over Daniel, its maw gaping open, revealing enormous fangs, saliva dripping. In that moment of despair, when death seemed certain, his fingers accidentally brushed against the radio lying on the floor beside him. He remembered the 2 wires he'd managed to connect with tape. Maybe it was the power or the transmitter contact. He had nothing to lose. As the werewolf raised its clawed hand for the killing blow, Daniel lunged for the radio with his last ounce of strength and clamped his fingers onto the exposed wire ends, closing the circuit. There was a crackle of static, and an indicator light on the device glowed dimly. Help. Attack. Tower. Black Creek. Monster. He yelled fragmented words into the microphone before the werewolf swatted the radio aside with a blow from its paw. It seemed to be over. The monster loomed over him again, its eyes burning with hatred. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the final impact. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard a deafening roar, but it didn't come from the werewolf. He opened his eyes and saw the impossible. From the darkness of the woods, the same gigantic entity that had frightened them the previous evening stepped onto the tower platform. Now, up close, he could see it more clearly. An enormous creature covered in thick, dark hair, moving on 2 legs with massive shoulders and long arms. Bigfoot. The legendary creature was real, and it was here. Bigfoot, without another sound, launched itself at the werewolf with incredible, almost unbelievable speed and strength for its size. It seized the wolf-like monster in its immense hands as if it were a rag doll. The werewolf shrieked and tried to break free, clawing and biting its attacker, but it was futile. Bigfoot lifted it overhead, and with tremendous force repeatedly smashed it against the trunk of the massive tree nearest the tower. The impacts were sickeningly dull and heavy. The werewolf's bones snapped with hideous crunching sounds. Bigfoot hurled the limp body to the ground. What had been a terrifying monster moments before had been reduced to a shapeless ruin of fur, bone, and blood. Daniel stared at the monstrous execution, eyes wide. The sight was so horrific, so far beyond comprehension, his mind refused to process it. The pain in his leg, the endured terror, the shock of what he'd witnessed, it all merged into one unbearable flood. His head spun, darkness pulling him under. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the huge, dark figure of Bigfoot standing over the mangled body of the werewolf, slowly turning its head toward him. Consciousness returned slowly, reluctantly, pulling him from a thick darkness. The first sensation was a dull ache throughout his body, especially his leg. Then he felt softness beneath him and smelled a sharp, sterile scent, antiseptic. He forced his eyes open. Above him were the white tiles of a ceiling, inset with fluorescent lights. He was lying in a bed, covered by a thin white blanket. An IV stand stood beside him, a thin tube running to a bandage on his arm. A hospital room. He was alive. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his leg made him groan and sink back onto the pillows. Immediately, a nurse in a white uniform entered. Seeing him awake, she smiled, said something soothing, and pressed the call button. Soon a doctor appeared, an older man with tired eyes. He examined Daniel, checked his reflexes, asked a few simple questions. Daniel learned that rescuers had found him. His garbled radio transmission had been picked up by the ranger station on the park border. The signal was weak and intermittent, but it had been enough to pinpoint the approximate location of the tower. A rescue team reached him several hours after dawn. They'd found him unconscious at the base of the dilapidated watchtower with a severe laceration on his leg and numerous bruises and scratches. He hadn't yet spoken about what happened at the tower. He didn't have the strength. But the worst news was yet to come. After the doctor confirmed his condition was stable, 2 men in uniform entered the room, police officers or park security. They spoke gently, but their faces were grave. They informed him that during the search operation, not far from the tower, rescuers had discovered human remains. A chill went through Daniel. "Mark?" he whispered. One of the men nodded grimly. "We believe they belong to your friend, Mark Henderson. The body was badly mutilated, practically torn apart. Identification was difficult, but belongings and ID found nearby leave little doubt." Daniel closed his eyes. So his worst fears were confirmed. Mark was dead, but the way he died, torn apart, like the tent, like the werewolf after the fight with Bigfoot. But there was more. The officers shared another detail, one that seemed insignificant at first against the backdrop of Mark's death, but later forced him to see everything in a terrifying new light. Black Creek National Park, where he'd come at his friend's invitation, had actually been officially closed to the public for about 6 months. Completely closed. All entrances were blocked, patrols increased, or so they were supposed to be. Closed? But why? Daniel rasped. The reason for the closure, Mr. Adams, the senior officer replied, was a series of unexplained incidents within the park over the last year. Several tourist disappearances, and several very violent deaths. The bodies recovered were so badly mauled that grizzly bears were initially suspected, but the nature of the injuries was atypical. Daniel's heart clenched again. And then came the final, most horrifying fact. "Your friend, Ranger Mark Henderson," the officer continued, watching Daniel intently, "has been officially listed as missing for the past 4 months. He disappeared during a patrol in the closed section of the park. 4 months. Daniel felt his blood run cold. He'd received the letter from Mark just over a month ago. The invitation had been sent after Mark officially vanished. The realization hit him with stunning force. The Mark he'd met at the cabin, cheerful, smiling, with that feverish gleam in his eyes, hadn't been his friend. Or at least, not entirely him. Was it the werewolf itself, having taken his friend's form to lure him deeper into the woods toward its mysterious discovery? Or had Mark truly found something terrible in the forest, something that changed him, drove him mad, and then killed him? Or had his friend fallen victim to the werewolf or something else long before Daniel's arrival? His return merely part of a sinister plan orchestrated by unknown forces inhabiting this cursed forest. He lay in the hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling tiles. He had been saved, but his body and soul were scarred. He had survived thanks to the intervention of the monstrous Bigfoot, a creature of legend that was not only real but capable of incredible brutality. But the truth about what happened to Mark, about the creature that had hunted them in the forest, and about the true role of the giant who saved him at the cost of a gruesome slaughter, remained hidden in the shadows of the closed Black Creek National Park. Questions swarmed in his mind, but there were no answers. Was the werewolf somehow connected to Mark's disappearance? Was it the discovery Mark had been so eager to show him? And why had Bigfoot intervened? Protecting its territory? Or did it have other motives? The forest kept its secrets, and Daniel knew he would never forget the horror he'd faced there, nor would he ever learn the full, bitter truth.